Hi, I'm Dr. Marion Parker, and I'm going to talk to you today about the ERAS application. I hope that by the end of this presentation, you will have a much better understanding about how to leverage this important part of the application process to your best advantage. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to talk today first about the application vetting process, making sure that we all understand what the holistic application review is and the EACM model. I'm then going to move into some data-driven information about what program directors think matters, specifically in regards to items that influence the interview selection process, program signals, geographic preferences, and the ever important ERAS experience section. And finally, I'm going to give you some general guidelines, sort of my approach for applicants in writing their ERAS application. So, holistic application review. The ultimate goal, really, with any residency selection process or employment process, when you're applying for another type of job, because this is a job, this is a job selection process, is to identify those candidates who are highly likely to succeed in a given program and those who will align with the organizational mission that that educational residency program or that institution has. The holistic review process integrated into residency selection really aims to achieve that particular result. And many places are using holistic review. If we look at data from 2022 in the NRMP Program Director Survey that asked program directors, to what extent are you using a holistic model in your application review? And this was a assessment across specialties of medicine. You can see here that the majority of program directors, a little bit, almost 90% said they were either using the holistic EACM model moderately, considerably, or a great deal. So yes, residency programs are increasingly incorporating holistic review into their review of applicants, although different programs have different formulas and you will not know for certain how they are exactly incorporating that. I can tell you as well that the major tool that residency programs use to funnel applicants after they've done some initial work in ERAS is via something called Thalamus, and Thalamus is quickly ramping up more and more capabilities to allow for program directors to do holistic review. So it is definitely here to stay. The holistic review framework of the AAMC was actually originally geared for medical school admissions, but has subsequently been adapted for residency selection. And it's important to understand that this framework can be used at various points in the application cycle for applicant screening, for interview selection, for creation of rank order lists. So some institutions may use it for all, some for only one of these things, but as we've just seen, most will use it in some fashion. It really does, if used well, allow for some flexibility and an individualized assessment of an applicant's capabilities. And really, I look at it in general, what it's supposed to do is encourage really a truly balanced consideration of an applicant's total portfolio. Of course, as mentioned, it really can drive mission-driven and diversity-oriented resident selection. It requires that you really look at an individual through a larger aperture, as if it were a camera. You widen your lens, and therefore the selection model is usually depicted as ever-widening circles that represent different dimensions, influences on an individual. The EACM model stands for the following: experiences, attributes, competencies, and metrics. And we're going to briefly just look at each one of these. So experiences relate to that journey that the applicant has taken up to this point in their life and the context in which this journey has occurred. So there are outer influences, the region, the nation, the world. And then their inner ring, which is considered the applicant's path or sort of personal level experiences. So an applicant's education, the community service they've performed, their leadership roles, their life experience, other experiences they may have had in healthcare, research, professional associations that they may have been part of, etc. So these are the two outermost rings that we look at. The next one have to do with attributes of an individual. So you can see here that this relates to skills and abilities, personal qualities, and sometimes some demographic factors. But I've just listed a few here. This is in by no measure meant to be all inclusive, but we see things like, does this individual have good problem solving capabilities? Are they curious? Are they adaptable? Can they collaborate well? What about their integrity? What about their sense of humility, cultural competence, leadership skills, their compassion and empathy, their proficiency in maybe a given language that might be important to a certain program? And you can, I think, get a sense that if they really hone in on these kinds of attributes, they may be certain kinds of skill sets, certain kinds of abilities that might be more necessary or more prized for one type of specialty than another. So think about that, and for a given program, an academic program that's in a university might look at some different things and want certain kinds of attributes more so or in a different way than a program that may be, in a small rural community. The third part of EACM is competencies, which refer to the way in which applicant applies their knowledge, skills, and abilities. And these are the same um, competencies that are used by the ACGME to assess resident performance throughout residency. They're the same competencies when you join a hospital that they will assess you in terms of your suitability to become to be part of the hospital physician group. They're used in many ways. And these competencies are patient care, medical knowledge, professionalism, practice-based learning and improvement, which really I think of as your self-improvement. Do you self-assess yourself? Are you someone who's constantly trying to improve yourself? System-based learning has to really do with a lot of things, but really how do you integrate into, how do you understand medical practice? Do you understand various ways in which departments in a hospital are integrated? Do you understand something about Medicare and Medicaid and how people's insurance? Do you understand basic tenets of patient safety? That's sort of system-based learning. And then last, interpersonal and communication skills. Finally, the last metric right in the middle of that sort of bullseye are quantitative measurements, right? Your GPA, the favorite USMLE score, which is, which is really the most common metric that's used because it's hard to compare GPAs, especially with people from foreign universities, because they're really not, they're oftentimes really different than what occurs here in the United States. COMLEX scores as well, if you're a DO applicant, scholarly activities, the number, the breadth, whether you've done US clinical rotations, US clinical experiences is listed there, what your MSPE shows in terms maybe of your class ranking, etc. So these are numbers that apply to the holistic process. And hopefully the idea is that they look at all these things and then they say, wow, this is the ideal candidate for which we're screening for. And they find many of those attributes in you, the applicant, and they invite you for an interview. So it's really about helping a program predict how a given residency applicant might contribute to the institution and the program's mission and vision. So that's holistic review. I hope it's clear it's not just about academic performance and metrics that programs are using. They're looking for specific individuals who are a fit for their program, and programs will actually develop blueprints, spend a lot of time doing this, stop trying to figure out who their ideal candidate is, and that description will help them cull those potential residents from thousands of applications. So, your ERAS application, though, provides you many opportunities to showcase your value. And it always pains me when I see applications that unfortunately don't understand this and really give away opportunities to sell themselves. Okay. Now, what do program directors think matters? Hmm, that's an interesting question. People ask me all these things all the time. Is it my USMLE scores? Is it my year of graduation? What about honors and awards? Does that matter? What about if I did a prior residency or I have an advanced degree? Or does it really matter if I volunteered or not? There's a whole variety of things that are listed here on the left of the slide. And then there's the ERAS application itself. How important is that? What about the experience section? What about my personal statement? What about my letters of recommendation, my MSPE, or anything else that's there? So, different programs obviously think about these things in different ways potentially, but I'm going to show you what at least a whole group of program directors from across specialties think. When they surveyed in the 2024 ERAS Program Director Survey, they asked program directors to identify items that they deemed were important, not important, very important, whatever. It was a Likert scale in the interview selection process. I picked those ones that are important or very important in the interview selection process. Number one, you can see letters of recommendation. 75% of program directors said these are important or very important. Personal statements, same thing. Step 2 CK score or your COMLEX, your level 2 score, 74%. Whether or not you had a failure is really what this is, was very important to them, especially in your step 2. What your MSPE said was important. Now, if you look beyond that and you look at everything else that I have listed here, these are items that are all in your ERAS application. How you chose program signals, what your geographic preferences were, your selected experiences, those experiences that you chose as meaningful experiences, how you constructed your meaningful experience sort of short essay. There is medical school reputation in there, but we that's not obviously part of the application. Your experiences, the focus areas that you chose to identify as the main area of an experience. Your impactful experience essay, if you wrote it, and then under experiences, the key characteristics that you chose to identify given experiences with. So many things on here that program directors think are important or very important in the interview selection process are parts of your ERAS application. And not paying attention to that and not understanding that, I think is a big, is unfortunate. Okay, now this gets a little bit more specific, but it also looks at parts that I think are all in your ERAS application that may also be echoed in your letters of recommendation and your MSPE, your personal statement. But look at this. History of overcoming significant obstacles. 74% of program directors said that these influenced their decision making. Your perceived commitment to the specialty, 72%. And in terms of perceived importance, those numbers on the right, that had a 4.4 out of 5 perceived importance ranking. Diversity characteristics of an applicant, because they don't want all the same types of applicants. Most programs want some kind of diversity, although what exactly that diversity is not obviously clear or spelled out necessarily. Leadership qualities. Does your application speak to your ability to lead? What about professionalism and ethics? Are you able to communicate that in certain ways? Did you check off a box that said, this is a discussion about, my ethical competency? Volunteer and extracurricular activities, they matter. It matters. 61% of people said that was important in their decision making. Other life experiences, and then I added these because it's evidence of continuous medical education, because a lot of people ask about that. What if I took a year off or 2 years off, did something else, raised my kids, moved to the country? What do people think about that? And they still considered it, but obviously less so. What about my demonstrated interest in research? 42% said that was interesting to them, but obviously 58% did not really think that it was an important part that influenced their interview selection. And then interest in an academic career. Now, those 19% might have felt very strongly that those influenced the selection, maybe in very competitive programs, but in general, not really. Less than 20% of program directors. Okay. Now, let's go a little bit into program signals, because that has been a big thing for the last couple years. They changed the way that the program signals in many of the programs were designed this last year, adding program signals, adding tiers of program signals with some programs. And so we're still trying to tease this all out. But here's what I want you to take away from this. The vast majority of programs opted in for the use of program signals. 91% did in 2024. And how they used program signals is further delineated here. So some 19% used it as simply as an initial screen. They didn't do anything else. Some used it as part of an initial screen with other data, but before conducting a holistic review. But 53% used it as part of the holistic process to decide who to interview. So I think we'll see it's very clear that program signals are very important, although it's not so clear exactly what is the best strategy in terms of using program signals. Now look at this as a tiebreaker in determining who to interview. So they have two people they're looking at, and one of the applicants signaled that program. Seems like, at least to some program directors, that helps them in knowing who to give the interview to. And then, of course, they use it during an interview to sort of ask the individual what they knew about the program, why did they signal it, etc. So program signals. Program directors felt that the program signals really helped them to identify applicants that they might not have otherwise looked at. So overlooked applicants. So that's important, that your program signal may get you looked at into a program where they might not have otherwise looked at you. And 41% thought that people who signaled them were better aligned with the program than those who did not signal them. But obviously they didn't look at everybody who didn't signal them, so that's kind of hard for me to understand how they got that data necessarily. Gold signals are clearly valued more by the program. You can see most of the programs did differentiate between gold and silver. They did not have equal value. Almost 70% of the program said that gold signals were more valuable than silver signals. Okay, moving to geographical preferences, because I oftentimes get people who leave this section blank, or they don't write much in the section. They sort of think they're going to be, if they just don't put anything in, it's probably a better tactic. And I would say probably not almost all the time. There may be certain circumstances when that would be appropriate, but probably not. So here we go again. If we look at how they're used, again, just like with the program signals, we can see that 53% of the time they're used as a part of the holistic process to decide who to interview. And bingo, again, at least a certain percentage of program directors will use them as a tiebreaker to decide who to interview, and then to prepare for the interview. Use of selected experiences. So this is one of the things that I really hone in on when I work with people on their ERAS application, because it's such an important part of the holistic review. 75% of individuals reported that the selected experiences they use as a part of their holistic application. Not many use those as tiebreakers. They did use it to identify applicants whose focus areas, and you'll see what those are, whose focus areas align with their mission, whose key characteristics aligned with their mission, and whose meaningful experiences align with their mission. And then, of course, as you might expect, they used it a lot in preparation for the interview because you oftentimes, most of your questions may derive from those sections. What about the impactful experiences section? That's a part of the application that is optional. And there are many reasons for an applicant to use this section and should, if they have a reasonable situation that would allow them to include that section. But 72%, if there it was included, seemed to think that it was very important in terms of holistic application. It was used to put the application into a broader context. So I think that's important. And then again, to prepare for interviews, because sometimes the impactful experience, this section, especially if it's used for instance, explaining why someone did not do well on something, and they're talking about the personal and situational um, things that were going on at the time in their life that might have precluded that, they do get kind of personal. And so you think that people would want to use that in preparation for an interview. Okay, so I've talked about program signals. I've talked about geographic preferences. I wanted to just tell you what we have now in data from ERAS, from actually the NRMP in terms of the use of program signals. So they looked at AAMC and with ERAS analysis looked at the relationship between program signaling and being invited for interviews. So what they were really trying to do was look at program signal to interview conversion rates. Okay, that's what their goal was. And you know, here they said that if you did not signal the programs, oftentimes interview rates for applicants could really approach zero, very low. If you gave it, if there was a two-tier signal, you certainly did better than individuals who did not send a signal, but not quite as well as if you sent a gold signal. And I think you can see here very clearly what that looked like. So here, and this is across internal medicine programs, and this particular plot is looking at U.S. grads, um, both MDs, DOs, US IMGs, and non-US IMGs. So it's all collective. So I think you can see that the average individual who sent a gold signal had a 40% chance about the median in terms of an interview, getting an interview. Whereas if it was a silver signal, I don't know what that is, about less than 25%, and you didn't send one at all, it was somewhere about 2%, 2.5%. Now, it mattered. The same could not be said to be true of different groups. So here I've just put MDs, DOs, and then IMGs. And this is, I believe, US and non-US IMGs all looped together. But you can see that MDs, US trained physician, US graduates from medical schools here in the United States, allopathic medical schools, fared much better in terms of interview rates across the board with the three-tiered signals versus DOs who had very similar rates as opposed to IMGs, who, although that tier pattern persists, with gold signals being much stronger than silver and way more stronger than no signal, you can see that you have really less of a boost. What about geographic preferences? This is the same idea, geographic preference to interview conversion. That's what they're looking for. And again, this is internal medicine, all groups. And you can see that if you had geographic preference alignment, you were much more likely to be asked for an interview than if you had no geographic preference alignment. And there really wasn't much difference between no geographic preference or if your geographic preference was not aligned. So I would hope that from this geographic preference alignment, certainly you don't want to risk not taking advantage of that when you complete your geographic preference section. Okay, moving on to the last part, general approach to the ERAS application. So the ERAS application is used in interview selection of applicants And typically, it depends on the program, but I usually like to tell people with a lot of specialties that the number of applicants to interviews is that you might have, a 1 in 10, maybe if you're lucky, chance of getting an interview. As an IMG, um, it's about, it's even less than that. But about 1 in 10, you can see this now in the residency um, uh, Residency Explorer that is available to you from the AAMC. You can look to see how many applications any given program received, what was the conversion rate for interviews, and then you can drill it down further. But just recognize that the ERAS application is used for interview selection. It can be used in preparation for and during interviews, and then for rank order list decisions. So it has it plays an important role at multiple different points. As I've already said, it really is an opportunity, this application, to showcase who you are and how you exemplify tenets of professionalism, of ethics, of communication that are really essential for physicians. It is a very deliberate structure. There is a very deliberate structure to this application. It is not just a random exercise. You start off with demographic data, your education, your postgraduate training. You have some other details that you fill in there. If you've gotten awards, if you've gotten certifications, which sometimes people just fail to add, unfortunately. It then goes into your geographic preferences and program signaling, as well as if you wish to, geographic preferences and your setting preferences, the urban versus suburban versus rural. And then you have selected experiences. With each selected experience, and you have 10 of them, you have to indicate what your title was, how long you had that experience, what the setting was, what the primary focus area was, and you're restricted to certain key focus areas that you can select from. Same thing for key characteristics, all of which are parts of professionalism when you really think about it. You have a 750 character narrative, that is characters, not words, to address the context, roles, and responsibilities that you had during this selected experience. It's very little time to do this. And then out of the 10 experiences that you have, you pick 3 of them as being most meaningful. And then you have an additional 300 characters to write about why that experience was most meaningful for you. I already talked about honors, awards, professional memberships, license certifications. You also have impactful experiences, which is this optional section to talk about ways in which your life was impacted that may have affected your journey towards residency. You have a long section to put in your scholarly activities and properly delineate what type of activity they were. And then there is also another area where you can describe your hobbies and interests, and you have some space. You have 500 characters to do that as well. So it is not, your hobbies and interests aren't they're important too. They're oftentimes things that can spur on interesting discussions with the person who's interviewing you. Okay, so we've already talked about this, but obviously, program signals and geographic preferences, the alignment of these increase your chances of obtaining an interview. And to get on a rank order list and to even have a chance at getting into a program, you must get an interview. We saw the stepwise effect that occurs, and recognize they're not really additive. So if you signal the program and you also have geographic preference for that region, it may not really boost you to any significant degree. When considering where to use your program signals, I just emphasize to go back to the AAMC's Residency Explorer, look at the number and the types of applicants who signaled a given program, look to see if there was an overwhelming number of people who signaled a program. Perhaps that doesn't really allow your signal to stand out. So there's a lot of work you have to do in advance before you decide where you're going to use, especially your gold signals. Don't try to please everyone. Don't leave your geographic preferences blank, as I've already stated, although there may be some exceptions to this, especially if you're applying to incredibly competitive specialty, then you may have to just say, I'm willing to go anywhere. Your experience section, I talked about what you have in that section, and I wanted to just go over the primary focus areas. So you get to choose with the primary focus area, whether it's basic science, whether it's clinical translation science, which is essentially clinical work, whether it community involvement, whether it was customer service, engagement in healthcare administration, whether you were improving access to care, involved in medical education, whether it was something outside of medicine, it was something in music or athletics or art, whether you were promoting wellness, working in the public health sphere or quality improvement or social justice, or if it was some kind of technology project. So, pretty broad areas. And what a lot of places I believe are really looking for is that you have some interest and you have some variation in your application and that everything isn't a clinical translational science focus area. Key characteristics. This has to do with you're taking that experience and you're trying to say, what do I think I would like to communicate about that experience? And that experience might fit into any number of key characteristics. You might say this experience really helped me to improve my communication skills because I did X, Y, and Z. Or you might say, it improved my empathy and compassion for other individuals in this way, etc. Almost any experience you have probably can be pigeonholed for the purposes of this application into one or more of these key characteristics. But you have to make a decision. And when you write about it, you have to demonstrate in that short amount of space that you have how it would be related. Most people, they write their application and then they start to try to choose these focus areas and key characteristics, and they don't go through it ahead of time in any kind of strategic fashion. Now, professionalism. I believe that this ERAS application has a lot to do with professionalism. And one of the things that I want you to understand that I don't have here as a slide, but when you ask program directors across the board, what is the most important thing they believe in ensuring success in a residency program? Across the board, surgeons, internal medicine doctors, pediatricians, family medicine, emergency room medicine, what do they all say is the most important thing to ensure the success of a resident in their program? Professionalism. Professionalism. Now, here what I've done is take the AAMC pre-professionalism competencies and crosswalk them to your ERAS application key characteristics. Look, pre-professional competencies, it's really important as a physician that you can communicate, that your oral communication, that your written communication, you're going to communicate with patients, with families, with other attendings, with subspecialists, with the community. Some of that communication may be in writing. Some of it may, be one-to-one. Maybe you give talks to the community, or you speak in a some kind of to your colleagues. You give lectures. Pre-professional competencies translates into the ERAS key characteristics of communication, a professionalism issue. Critical thinking and quantitative reasoning, much of what we do in medicine does have to do with critical thinking and how to solve problems. Not just necessarily a problem for a given patient, but sometimes problems in our hospital, other sorts of things that utilize these types of abilities, how to react in emergencies or urgent situations. So critical thinking, and they have it as quantitative reasoning, but the ERAS crosswalk is to critical thinking and problem solving. Cultural competence and service orientation, I think it most closely looks at cultural humility and awareness. Most people, this particular key characteristics, if they employ it, will find its way in through some volunteer activity that they've done, but not necessarily, but most of the time, will be will be in those types of experience sections. Social skills, ethical responsibility, service orientation. I think those are, sort of empathy and compassion, social skills, ethical responsibility. Those are the most likely ones to sort of crosswalk with that. I can't emphasize enough how, we have duties to our patients. If you look at our duties to our patients in terms of medical ethics, beneficence, doing the right thing for the individual, non-maleficence, not doing something that would be harmful, um, ensuring that there's justice when we look at how we practice medicine and we treat all individuals equally. Um, you know, a- a- Having integrity. So all of these things really comprise ethical responsibilities, and I think it's a very important category. Scientific inquiry, human behavior. You know, I put that in with sort of ingenuity and innovation. If you're doing interesting research, some recent applicants I know have worked on various cool kind of applications that they have worked on to help support patients or other physicians. So innovative type of research and stuff that you've done, reliability, dependability, resilience, adaptability, crosswalks, exactly the same. Capacity for improvement is that self-reflection and improvement, or that ACGME competency that I talked about. And then teamwork, and with ERAS, they combine it in teamwork and leadership, either or both. So I hope that that gives you sort of an understanding of the fact that all of these key characteristics are also really considered professionalism competencies. Okay, what about the ERAS application experience? As I said, it should start way before you sit down to fill in the contents. I have this picture here of someone who's kind of going through these experiences, with little post-it notes and trying to figure out, which of the experiences that that she's had, are maybe the ones that are most meaningful. I think you should choose things in different focus areas. I think you should look for things that, as much as possible, are longitudinal and not pick something that you did just once for a couple hours. I don't think that that's, as good, obviously, as something that you've done for over a period of time or for a short period of time, but in an intensive way. I ask people to make sure that you demonstrate multiple key characteristics of the medical professionalism. Don't just pigeonhole yourself into one or two. So, although focus areas and key characteristics are not going to be required, they are not force fields in your application. Do not leave them blank. Every year I see applications where people leave these blank. And if you remember, we looked at how important some of those things were in individuals selecting applicants for interviews, and leaving them blank is like, again, it's just like giving away opportunity to sell yourself to programs. ERAS application experiences. Don't write in bullet points. I understand that there are some programs out there on YouTube that tell you should write in bullet points. I don't agree. I don't think they create meaning or connection with another individual. If you read a bulleted list of almost anything, there is no emotional content in there. The individual themselves who's reading has to try and, fill in the blanks. I don't think it works well. I really tell people, try to write 1 to 2 short paragraphs that are really truly meaningful. You don't have to cram in every single thing that you did in a given experience. That is not the point. Aim for clarity. Ensure that your spelling and your punctuation, your capitalization are perfect. I see many that are not. Please, please, please do not use AI. Your experience section, if you do that, will read like applicants speak, sort of this AI applicant speak, which is very distinguishable and feels very disingenuous to those of us who read these applications. It doesn't have any sense of who you are when you do that. So please don't use that. And, as always, I say it's really probably a good idea to get a professional review before you submit. I'm not going to really say anything about other sections of the application. I think that the impactful experience section is one that you use if you can and if it's appropriate. In terms of publications and all that, I would just say make sure that you enter your applications appropriately, that you use the correct format. I still see applications that is put in sloppily, not using standardized formats for how you write about a poster, a presentation, whatever. Make sure that if it's something that has been submitted but isn't yet published, that it's in the right section. You don't want to get caught in any way sounding as if you were trying to include something, or you're trying to get away with something because you think that it's going to be published and you've gotten all sorts of positive responses, and then the end that it's not. It's very hard. You can't change your ERAS application once it's in. Hobbies and and interests. As I've alluded to, that's an interesting section because sometimes what you put down there may be what you talk about with your interviewer for much of the interview. It may create a connection with you. They may be really fascinated by something. So think about your hobbies and your interests that you've had over time, not something that you did when you were 8 years old and don't do it anymore, but things that you've done recently that you think might be are different, might be interesting, and would provide some some exchange with an interviewer. Okay, so that's really all I want to say about the application process. My final thoughts about your ERAS application, and it's really very simple. Every part of your application, and specifically every part of your ERAS application, is critically important. Residency selection is sort of a look at all of the parts of your application. So yes, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, but every single piece matters. And that's why I chose to create this drawing here with use of puzzle pieces, where every little piece that you put in, there is a strategy about it and there is an importance to it. Really make sure you use your ERAS application along with that ever important personal statement to paint a picture of who you are. Why are you choosing to go to that particular residency? What are the ways in which you would really align with that specialty and with that type of program that you're applying to? And finally, don't try to do your ERAS application or really any part of your application at the last minute. You need to be able to put it away and come back to it so that you have ample time for review and reflection, so that you feel really, really satisfied in the end when you press the submit button for your application, that you feel like you've really written strong sections in the experience part that really convey who you are and show a breadth of experience. All right, that's it for now. I just want to remind you that I'm here for anybody who is interested in getting some expertise in terms of guidance for their application, whether it's your ERAS application, your personal statement, your mock interviews, match strategy, etc. So thank you all for your time today. I hope this has been helpful. I certainly welcome comments.